Hi class, welcome to Module 5 of American Family Systems. As we move forward with this, again, I've given you some music to think about this chapter. We're going to talk about sexual identity, behavior, and relationships. And I give you Mambo number 5. Okay? Kind of pick this up. Not going to play it long. But an interesting thought. My daughter, the pharmacist, when this was first very, very popular, the pharmacist called it the cave song. As we start thinking about the fact of the difference between sexual. So let me also tell you that your other music here is from Rent. And if you know the history and the story of Rent, this one happens to be the season of love. It's talking about a very diverse population. We're looking at social economic differences, and we're looking at gender differences within this.
525,600 minutes, 525,000 months a day, 525,600 minutes. How do you measure it?
So I'll leave those for you to explore at a deeper level if you choose to. But just thinking about how often we consider sex as part of that social system, our involvement with sex, our whole experience as we look at sexual identity and our behavior. And what's interesting is we really do look at social roles. So let's pop over to the PowerPoint and look at this at a little bit deeper level. And I apologize, it's kind of cutting off some of the PowerPoint, but if I make it too large, I don't know as if, pull it over a little bit for you. Okay, so masturbation is the sexual stimulation of one's own body. And so as we look at this, think about the historical and the cultural influences on our sexuality. When did you learn about masturbation? Did you use the right words for the parts of your body, or the menses, as we look at the women's menstrual cycle as we go into play? You know, so much of this is not talked about, hidden. Overview historically, especially in America, we haven't talked about sex a great deal. Now, in this semester I'm teaching sex and gender. We don't talk about this a lot at all, that there are a significant number of differences, that there is this biological difference that comes into place, and that's different than gender, isn't it? We mentioned that back in chapter 2, that we started talking about sex and gender, but we started talking about the social ramifications of being born one sex or another, or belonging to one gender group or another. Now we're looking at it a little bit deeper here. And so when we start looking at biology, people are born with the male anatomy or the female anatomy, and there's a certain amount of the population that are born intersexed. Now, our book doesn't give us necessarily that definition or that amount of people out there. The text I'm using for sex and gender says 1 in 100, and a recent video and research done coming out in the UK are indicating 1 in every 50 are born with genitalia that do not clearly identify them, and they're ambiguous whether they're a male or a female. Then we have other issues like transgender. That's when a person feels as comfortable, if not more so, expressing the gender traits associated with another sex, with the other sex, or other sex. Okay. So what we're looking at here is basically someone who may be born into a male body and feel more like they're a female. And they associate the attributes that we sociologically and attribute to females, okay? So part of this is biological. Part of this comes through this process of learning to know oneself and fitting into that process. Now, your book goes on to talk about transsexual and sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is the romantic patterns of choice, the sexual and romantic patterns. Now, what's interesting is here they talk about heterosexual attraction for the opposite sex, homosexual, the attraction for the same sex. They talk about bisexual, where people are attracted to both sexes, but they don't talk about asexual in the book. And there are people who are born without an attraction to either sex. And we're studying that particular area more as well. A significant part of family, isn't it? So families, depending on sexual orientation, look different than they've ever looked before. And they fit differently based on sexual orientation. So it's important to consider these things. And again, remember our book is about 3 years old. So the attitudes towards LGBT, and we now use more initials with that. We use LGBTQ, and there are, depending on what the situation is, to look at these. But in general, sociology is very concerned about the stereotypical beliefs and the prejudice that are tied to this. And in this case, we're talking about prejudice and the fear of those that are homosexual, and we call it homophobia, okay? And we hear these fears or this prejudice coming into place in so many ways, such as we talked about within race, or we will talk about later about aging, and we have ageism that comes into place. All right, so we are changing in this country, aren't we, as far as acceptance of the diverse population. In fact, so much so that we have now, the Supreme Court has now legalized gay marriage in all states, even those states that have officially disagreed with it. Now, automatically you can start picking up this particular issue, right? In fact, you did in Chapter 2 as you started to look at news articles and the refusal back and forth. And you can see the social movement going on here, and you can see the resistance to the social movement. And the stand, you're going back and forth. This will be an area that will be continued to be argued about for a long time. Now, I've already moved on to the next slide on sexual scripts. These are important parts in this chapter to understand that those are the rules and norms regarding sexual behavior. We learn sexual scripts from the culture we're born into. So the difference between a Hispanic person, especially those maybe from Mexico, and someone who has grown up in the United States is pretty clear. And we see that family pattern coming into place in the role of where men and women fit. We could go back to those beginning videos that we looked at in Chapter 2, and we could see the macho man, but we see the macho related to culture when we explore a Hispanic family and that role of patriarchy in the process. By the way, knowing many Hispanic families and working with them very intently as a social worker for a period of time, we find out that the man often is in that position of ruler of the family or organizer of the family, but he's really controlled by that communication that exists between his wife or his daughters in there. It makes a difference, doesn't it? These sexual scripts and our interpersonal communication between us and our partner. This is one of the things that we look at in the communication chapter. Actually, people communicate different based on their sex. It's automatics in the way our mind thinks. And then we have the sexual script on our personal view. Now, should somebody be allowed to open the door? Where are they at? How they work within that process? We can see the roles we play based on how we identify who we are within that gender concept. And we see this issue of double standards. That's the idea that men have been allowed far more permissive in sexual behavior than women. I started you with Mambo number 5. The very exposed women, but one man could have all those women. Could one woman have all those men? And we see this double standard come into play in the way of sexual behavior, and we see it in the way of dating, getting out, and it can be confusing, this double standard of where people are in place. So, studying early human sexuality, the pioneers out there. As I said before, in the United States, we don't talk about sex a lot. Other countries are much more open in talking about their sexuality. And so we see some early research being done out there by Kinsey and a number of other people out there. And we get this idea of moving forward and understanding. In fact, when we did some initial studies, because we use voluntary samples, there was a prediction that the homosexual population was much higher than what we seem to indicate today. So there's a lot of variety that goes on. And think about this. How are you going to respond if somebody's asking you questions about your sexuality? Not the easiest thing to talk about. Sexology is a field that comprises multidisciplinary groups of clinicians, researchers, and educators who really study sexuality to understand it at that deeper level, and to explore sexual behaviors. Now, when we look at sexual behaviors, we look at oral sex, okay? We look at the oral stimulation of a woman's genital by her partner as we look at that process, and we explore how behaviors exist out there. Now, sexuality is expressed throughout our lifetime, becomes a major piece, and we see this predicted pattern of understanding that there are gendered behaviors. Girls behave in this way, boys behave in that way. And then we get the experience of masturbation for boys, oftentimes wet dreams, as we move on into that sexual maturity. And so that we see that it moves forward. Now, about half of high school students in grades 9 through 12 have had sexual intercourse, and about 1/3 are currently sexually active. This is a statistic that we've looked at repeatedly as we survey children in high school to see where they're at, and we see this number constantly growing to understand this behavior. I'm going to leave the rest of the PowerPoints for you because you have some work to do related to STDs, and bring them into place as you would start talking about that. So let's look at what you need to do for this week. Obviously, the PowerPoints, look at them in a little more detail, your text, and I've asked you to go out to the CDC site this week and look at STDs and then contribute to the discussion board. You have no videos this week. I hope that helps you in the process. I think the videos are great and give you that alternative when we're online. But in this case, I really want you to look further at the level of STDs. Now, with that said, sex is important to family. Sexual involvement of a couple maintains a strong marriage relationship. In fact, in aging, we know that sex is important as well, and sexual contact is more than just the physical acts of sex or any of the other descriptions of sexual activities, but it includes the cuddling, the romance, the relationship, and the satisfaction. When there is sexual satisfaction in a relationship, it helps build that strong bond of family. not having ties together, affairs, breaking up, cheating, and or at least where both people don't agree on other sexual partners. Because remember, we could go off in a whole tangent of couples that swing or other things that come into place related to the sexual issue. But remember how important this is within the family function. Now, most Americans disapprove of extramarital affairs. I think it's interesting. I think you'll find this in articles as well, as we just had a website that wasn't for dating partners. Wasn't for getting partners together for a lifetime commitment, but was actually there to get them together for the ability to cheat on one spouse or another. And it was hacked, and these names were all exposed. But again, it is a decision of the couple of how they handle that or what they expect to occur. What's most interesting is that the age of sexual intercourse is dropping. The initial age of sexual intercourse is dropping, and that sexual intercourse occurs outside the bonds of marriage on a regular basis. And so, therefore, attitudes have greatly changed, and we can see that social influence. And therefore, behaviors change in that process, and it gets within that new world of hooking up and that casual sex. So, thinking about this, look at the sociological pieces, bring it together, explore this, and see where you're going. Let me know what you're thinking. I appreciate any input on how I can make this class better. Have a great day.